In this lesson, we're going to be talking about market efficiency and what does that look like? What does it look like whenever a market is running efficiently? When we're hit at that perfect equilibrium, and what does it look like when it's not running efficiently? We're gonna reach back and talk about price ceilings and price floors, and we're going to look at the effect that those can have on the market. I alluded to in previous lessons that whenever we are not operating at equilibrium, we have some negative consequences to that. And today, that is what we're going to be looking at. Okay, so here is a quick look at what we're going to be, the topics that we're going to be covering today: consumer surplus, producer surplus, deadweight loss, the effects of price ceilings, price floors, taxes, and a few other things in between. Okay, so first up, consumer surplus. Okay, so here's your book definition of consumer surplus. How I like to describe it to my students is essentially this: consumer surplus is simply the money left over in your pocket after you buy a particular good or service. And I'll explain what I mean by that here in a moment. Okay, so in this slide, we're looking at a demand curve. Consumer surplus is everything here in this triangle. Essentially, there are going to be individuals who are willing to pay at these higher prices, but they end up paying at this price. So whatever money is left over in your pocket is your consumer surplus. And we can see that a little clearer on the next slide. Okay, so on this graph, we can see our original price point right here, and this is that original consumer surplus. Now again, this is money, or extra money rather, in your pocket. Now if your price point was exactly this, then your customer surplus is right here and it's zero. But if you're willing to pay any dollar amount above whatever price this is, a great example of that is like if you go to let's say your TV goes out and you're willing to spend $1,000 on a television. And I'm not sure if you've been in the market for televisions, but lately televisions have been very, very cheap. So you walk in willing to pay $1,000 for the brand new 4K or 12K or whatever we're at now. I haven't bought TV in a while, but you walk in, you're willing to pay $1,000, but lo and behold, they say, "Oh, our price for exactly the one you want is $450." That extra $550 in your pocket, that is your customer surplus. That is the surplus is more or extra than. So that is the extra money that you have now that you didn't think you were going to have beforehand. So when we say customer surplus, that's what we're talking about. So in this slide, again, we have our first price point, and this first triangle represents our consumer surplus. Now what they're showing here is a price drop. So what happens when the price drops? So like we said earlier, right here at this dot, if that was your exact price point 1, then your customer surplus is 0. But anyone willing to pay more has a surplus of cash now in their pocket. Now, if the price drops down here to price 2, what happens? So first off, all this rectangle here represents all the people who were originally in the market. We'll just base it off my example, TVs. So they were all in the market for television. So instead of being $1,000, it was $550, just going off mine. And now the price dropped to $450. So this represents that $100 drop in price. Okay, this little triangle here represents the new customers now that are going to be able to purchase a television. So if someone was right here and that was their lowest amount, okay, there's going to be all sorts of people here who would be willing to buy a TV. In this section here, this part of the demand curve represents everyone willing to buy a television, but at price point 1, it was just too expensive. But at a price drop down here to the price point 2, again, I think we said that was going to be, I'm going to try to draw this out, $450 in our makeshift example. Okay, from here to here, now these are all the new customers who can now purchase a television because their price point was between 450 and 550. And so that's what this this triangle rather represent. This is the additional customers being added to the market, and this rectangle is the additional surplus. The original customers that we had in our original triangle are now benefiting from. Okay, so let's move into producer surplus. Producer surplus, like many aspects of supply and demand, it's going to be it's going to be almost exactly the same concept. We're just going to simply flip the way we look at it. Okay, in our definition, just like with consumer surplus, producer surplus is the extra income that a producer is going to receive who is willing to do the job or to sell the good or service for less. Okay, so just like with demand or with consumer, we have our price point here, and we have our right here would be our equilibrium. So all the consumers that were willing to do, or sorry, all the producers rather, who were willing to do the job or sell the good for cheaper, are represented here. So it'd be like, let's say you were selling, we'll just say muffins, and this is $3 a muffin. This person was willing to sell the muffin at 50 cents, but because the market says that a muffin is $3, this is the extra surplus this person is going to receive, the extra cash in their pocket, the extra money, the extra profit they're going to receive from the sale of this muffin, because they were willing to sell it for 50 cents in our little makeshift example, but now they're going to receive all that extra income. So if we look at, again, the same type of graph that we saw with consumer, but now we're going to analyze it from the producer side of things. So just like before, this represents our first price point. And we'll just stick with the muffins. Should have stuck with TVs, but I've dedicated myself to muffins. So here's our first price point at $3 a muffin. And this represents, again, all the people that are going to be making muffins. If this person right here making muffins, their price point is $3, and that means that they're breaking even. So anyone willing to do the job for less is going to receive either a little bit of surplus if they're up here, or a lot of surplus if they're down here. Okay, this rectangle, almost like consumer surplus, represents the extra surplus that these people are going to be making if the price moves up. If the price goes from price point 1, and now the price of let's say the price of muffin is now $4 instead of $3. So price goes up. This represents the extra surplus that these producers are going to be making. It's extra profit that they're going to be making. So this person here, that was, I'm going to change colors here so we can see it better. So this person here who was breaking even is now at this price point going to be receiving a little more in their pocket. They're actually be making profit on the muffins as long as they keep making them the same, and they could have produced it at $3 to break even, but now they're going to be making a profit of $1, and that's going to be their surplus. Okay, and now just like before, this rectangle here, actually not rectangle, triangle, this triangle here represents all the new producers that can now jump into the market, because at $3 a muffin, they just could not produce enough, or they couldn't produce a muffin that was low cost enough to make a profit or at least break even on the muffin. But at a price of $4, they can definitely either break even or they can now make money, depending on where they fall along here. But now they can enter the market because the market has moved up in price, and now it is worth the effort and time to produce the muffin, to join the market and begin to sell. So again, just like with producer and consumer or just like with consumer surplus, producer surplus, we just flip it and we just think about it from the producer or the business, from the business side of things. Think of it like a business owner, like you own a business and you're trying to turn a profit. So just to refresh, producer surplus is the extra money that they're going to be making off the sale of whatever good or service this is. When the price moves up, it creates even more surplus for those who are already in the market. And then over here, I'm going to change the color yet again. And then over here, this little triangle represents all the new producers that are going to enter the market, because the price going from $3 to $4 now makes it more, or makes it profitable enough for them to join the market. Okay, so at this point, we're going to look at what does it look like when we combine the two and look at a completed supply-demand graph, and we analyze it from customer surplus and producer surplus. Okay, in our book, we call this economic surplus. In other classes I teach, we call it total surplus. It all means the same thing. It's simply you're adding up the consumer surplus and the producer surplus to look at it in a way of, okay, in the economy, how much surplus is there, how much money is being exchanged, and how much people are benefiting from this market. So the idea is that the larger the surplus, the total surplus or the economic surplus, the larger the surplus that you have, the better people are off. So here we can see this is what that looks like. You have consumer surplus up here, and you have producer surplus down here. Kind of a good rule of thumb is you draw, I'm going to change colors for you. You draw a line from your equilibrium to your price point. Everything under that line is producer surplus, and everything above that line is consumer surplus. Because if this line right here divides those in two, and we'll just imagine that it severs that triangle and makes them two triangles. This right here is attached to the demand curve, making that for consumers. And then this one is now only attached to the supply curve, making that for producers. It's kind of the way I found that kind of easy way to look at it. And it kind of helps remind students on which side of the line is consumer, which side of the line is producer. So if you're ever given this graph and told to label it, producer is always going to be below your price point, and consumer will always be above your price point. So let's look at what happens whenever prices begin to move. So if your total surplus, or your economic surplus, is the total amount of producer and the surplus and the total amount of consumer surplus, and in the slide before, it was this entire triangle here off to the left. What happens when we begin to move prices, whether it happens naturally or artificially? We're going to talk about artificially here in a few slides, but it creates what this book calls missing economic surplus. Okay, we'll also have a different name for that coming up. But when the price begins to rise, it takes away from the consumer surplus, and it takes away from the consumer surplus, and it also takes away from the producer surplus. So when the prices begin to go up, in this case it's going to be artificially, it's going to eat away at that total or economic surplus, and we're left with this missing economic surplus, which we're going to define here in a moment. So this is what happens when the prices begin to rise. Okay, it takes away from mostly the consumer surplus, but this gray triangle also takes away from producer surplus. But the producers are definitely still better off. Okay, when prices go too low, or not too low, but go lower than what equilibrium says they should be, then producers are going to suffer more, or they're going to take a larger hit. Is now their triangle is much smaller, and this area here is now the new consumer surplus, which is still much less than it originally was, or if you could put numbers to it, we could find out if it was or not. Sometimes it breaks even, but most of the time, typically it's going to be less. But customers are still better off. Customers are happy, right? Low prices, we're happy. But either way, we are still left with this missing economic surplus. We've taken a large chunk out of our total or our economic surplus. I'm using those terms interchangeably because you can see both, whether it be in this class or if you take the macro class, your professor may call it total surplus. But so I'll try to use those two interchangeably. Okay, so the idea behind maximizing welfare and the reason why we look at this and why we think, okay, or why when we see that missing economic surplus, well, okay, why is that a big deal? Because the idea is that if we're maximizing surplus, if we're leaning on this equilibrium price point here, that means every cent available is either going to consumers or they're going to producers. Would producers love to have even more surplus? Absolutely. Would we love to get a better deal and take some of their surplus away? Absolutely. But that's not how the market works. We have to compromise. Would we want a TV for $100? Sure, we would. Would every TV manufacturer love to sell them for $2,000 if people were willing to buy it? Absolutely. But we have to come to that middle ground. We have to make those deals. We can do it individually, but most of the time it happens through, like we talked about earlier, hundreds of millions of interactions between buyers and sellers to come to these equilibrium prices. And this line represents essentially the compromise between what consumers want and producers want. So when we look at this entire filled in triangle, this represents the benefit of being in this market. Consumers are getting the maximum amount that they can get, and producers are getting the maximum amount that they can get. Okay, so let's move into what we call deadweight loss. Another name for the missing economic surplus is what we call deadweight loss. Okay, here's your definition of deadweight loss. But again, it's essentially that missing piece from your total surplus or your economic surplus. It's that gray triangle that we saw, which we're going to see here in a second. Again, this represents, or we can see it here, and this represents what your book's identifying correctly as the missing trades. These are the people that would have been in this market, whether it be consumers or producers, depending on if this price point here was below equilibrium, or if we put it higher than equilibrium, it would cause the same effect. But it would still cause this deadweight loss of individuals who have now left the market because the price has gone too high and they can no longer produce a good and make a profit, or it's gone too low and they can no longer produce a good to make a profit, or it's gone too high and they can no longer afford that item. But this deadweight loss is what eats away at our consumer surplus, and again, it eats away at our total surplus or our economic surplus. And our economic and total surplus represents the maximum benefit of all parties involved, both buyers and sellers in the market. Okay, so now let's look at some of these policies that we spoke about in the previous chapter, and let's look at their effects on the market. Okay, so first up, we have price ceiling. And remember, this is whenever the government puts a policy in place that does not allow for a price to rise above a certain amount. Traditionally, we use rent control as the prime example of that, but there's many others. So let's look at what happens in the market. First off, we see prices kept artificially low. This is where the price equilibrium should be, and this is where our price ceiling is down here. And so since our price is kept artificially low, this takes away from the producer surplus. They're definitely paying the burden of this policy. Now, again, if you want to flip over here in your mind's eye, just take this and move that down there. It looks like potentially, depending on if this is the scale or not, consumers are actually better off here. But who's actually better? Who's actually better off? It's going to be only the consumers who could originally afford it at the price. you're going to have a lot of consumers in this triangle who are now going to still be priced out of this market because of various reasons. It could be because some consumers are buying up even more than they otherwise would have because the price is so cheap, and so things are just simply sold out. This is what happens in New York a lot of times because prices of apartments are so cheap because of rent control laws. Some of the more wealthier individuals will actually buy one or two or three apartments, blow out walls, and create larger apartments. And so that's three apartments that could have gone to three different families. That's now being utilized by one wealthier family. Again, that's just one example there. Okay, let's look at the effect of price floors. Okay, price floors keep the price from falling below a certain amount and reaching that equilibrium price. So it keeps prices high. So whatever good or service this is, the consumers of this good are going to definitely be paying that burden because they would be getting all this surplus, but it's now been taken away and left up to this tiny triangle above. The producers of the surplus love the high prices, right? What producer doesn't love to make extra money on their product? So they're happy with it, but we still have created this triangle here that represents all the individuals that are no longer going to be able to participate in this market, creating this dead weight loss situation. Okay, and so lastly, let's look at what happens when a tax is introduced into a market. Okay, so here we have our example from last chapter, our $4 tax represented here. And we know it's $4 because we take our equilibrium price, which is at 10, and we say, okay, we see our taxes here at 12, and goes in the rectangle, it goes all the way here to 8. 12 minus 8 is 4, so this is a $4 tax on the market. So what's happened? Well, first off, here's our equilibrium price. This section right here, this little half of the triangle and half of the rectangle is where the consumer surplus would have been, but now it's been taken away by the tax. And then this right here represents the producer surplus that would have been there, but it's now gone because yet again it's been taken away by the tax. Let me erase this for us. Okay, so we still have our dead weight loss right here. Okay, and again, this represents the amount of money that the government is taking from this market. And you just simply would do your length times width based off, so 4 times 40. So that would be how much the government is making off this snapshot of the market. And then you could just run your equation for the surface area of a triangle here. Really, you do two, but you do both of those, add them together, and that would be how much of the market is now gone because of this tax. So you can see that a tax, though it works differently, will still take away from the market. Because remember, a tax will always raise the price of the good. Okay, but it also lowers it also simultaneously lowers the how much the producer is going to get for it. So where a price ceiling or price floor mostly affected one side of this graph or the other, the consumer surplus or the producer surplus, a tax will split both. It raises the price for the consumer and it lowers how much the producer is going to make. And so that's why you have your dead weight loss is more split among both sides of this. And so essentially these are the producers on this side. These are the producers that are now out of the market because they can't make any money on this good at $8 a unit. And then but at $12, these are the people here. I'm going to make it blue here. These people right here are the individuals who are now priced out because $12 per unit of whatever this is now too high. Okay, so this ends our lesson on market efficiency. And again, we went over what producer surplus, consumer surplus. Remember, both those together represent the total benefit of being in the market. And then we looked at the different policies that we went over last lesson, and we saw their effects on the market to kind of see what happens and why typically economists speak of those particular policies with sort of a negative undertone, is because if the goal is to maximize our consumer surplus and our producer surplus, each one of those takes away from the market, thus minimizing our total or economic surplus.